It was the summer of 1863. The American Civil War was in full swing. The Confederacy needed a victory badly. The divided American nation was at a crossroad called Gettysburg. Hi, my name is Sebastian, and you're watching Mistakes That Changed the World. By this point in the American Civil War, the Confederacy had suffered serious losses in the West. Despite this, the Union Army, although larger, was being held at bay in Virginia. Nevertheless, by June 1863, the South was in trouble. They needed a victory that would show that the Confederacy could not only defend itself, but could also take the war to the North. They needed to demonstrate that they had some chance of actually winning the war, not just continuing to resist. This could have prompted England and France to recognize the Confederacy as a nation, and that could have led to the European fleets breaking the Union blockade, and a whole new war would have followed. So this was the situation that forced Robert E. Lee to decide to take the Army of Northern Virginia north to Pennsylvania. It was a political move, not a military one. But this one mistake led to a series of events that had the opposite effect. In the end, the general doomed the Confederate cause because of some very uncharacteristic mistakes that he made in the vicinity of a small town called Gettysburg. We begin our story with the Grey Ghost at the forefront. John Singleton Mosby was the commander of the Virginia Cavalry, who snuck into the center of the Union Army and stole a copy of its plans. Those plans showed that there were gaps between the Union positions that could be exploited by Jeb Stuart's cavalry. This happened at the beginning of one of Lee's most daring maneuvers, the invasion of Pennsylvania. The cavalry's job was to protect the army's supply lines and cover its movements, while at the same time they had to disrupt the enemy's supply and report its movements. While the Union cavalry had improved considerably thanks to confidence and courage, the Confederate cavalry was still the dominant force. Undoubtedly, one of the bravest leaders of the Confederate cause was the aforementioned Jeb Stuart. His raids and other actions have repeatedly earned him distinctions from commanders and the respect of both sides. Mosby concluded his report to Lee about what he had learned with the recommendation that the best way to protect communications was to attack Hooker's supply lines. General Joe Hooker was the commander of the Army of the Potomac and a soon-to-be notorious loser of this war. In response, Stuart presented a plan to General Lee that involved a raid by a large portion of the troops under his command, practically most of the cavalry of the Army of Northern Virginia. They were to move behind the Yankees and towards the nearby city of Washington, D.C. Stuart was sure that this maneuver would create panic just like in the past and would force most of the Union horses to retreat and follow him. It would also have probably forced thousands of Union infantrymen who would otherwise have opposed Lee to remain on the defensive to defend the Union capital. There are indeed historians today who think that the Battle of Gettysburg took place because of the absence of Stuart's cavalry before and in the early days of the battle. In the accusations after the war, some said that Stuart was more interested in newspaper headlines than in doing his job. That, of course, wasn't quite the case. Stuart's idea of surrounding much of the Union Army appealed to Lee, who sent a note to General Longstreet, Stuart's direct commander, expressing a conditional agreement. Lee's order said that if Stuart could cross the Potomac River without alerting the Federals to the plan to attack the North in the Shenandoah Valley, he should do so. While the Confederate cavalry was waiting to cross into Pennsylvania, Stuart received Lee's orders on June 23rd. In part, it said, "If General Hooker's army remains inactive, you may leave 2 brigades to watch him, and with the other 3 you will retreat. But if it does not seem to be moving north, I think it is better to retreat tomorrow night on this side of the mountain, cross at Shepherdstown tomorrow, and go to Frederickstown. You will be able to judge if you can pass their army without problems, causing them as many losses as you can, and then cross the river east of the mountains. In any case, after you cross the river, you must go further and reach the right flank of Ewell's troops. Stuart was excited by the prospect of this mission. He believed that it would give him the opportunity to strike a major blow against the Union and to earn the admiration of Lee. But the effect of this order was that Stuart and most of his cavalry were absent during the first days of the Battle of Gettysburg. Thus, Lee had practically no information about the location of the Army of the Potomac before the battle. But Stuart did not desert, leaving on his own. He followed Lee's direct order. So, the number one mistake was Lee's willingness to send most of his cavalry on a mission just when he was beginning to enter enemy territory. At the same time, though, his intention to distract and force the Unionists to retreat to defend themselves from cavalry attacks was a valid strategy. We're not really in a position to judge whether this was more important than the less glorious role of gathering intelligence. Given that the true purpose of the movement north was to demonstrate the power of the Confederacy to Europeans, the publicity of such a raid combined with a victory against the Union Army would have had double benefits. So it was probably a calculated risk, but, as they say, the devil is in the details. Stuart left behind more than half of the cavalry units under his command. Lee was left with only enough forces to conceal his own movements, but he didn't have enough cavalrymen to maintain the flow of information about the Unionists led by Hooker and then Meade, who were moving to intercept him. After gathering his 2,000 cavalrymen for the raid, Stuart crossed the Potomac, where he had been ordered to go, and proceeded through the Bull Run Mountains. It was at this point that things started to take a downward spiral. In Haymarket, Confederate scouts discovered all of Hancock's infantry corps moving north, so they had no choice but for Stuart's cavalry to avoid the much larger force of infantrymen. This was part 1 of our story. Join me in the next episode to see how it all ends. In the meantime, I hope this video was interesting enough to have inspired you to look into it further on your own. If you liked it, leave a like and subscribe. Leave your comments downstairs, and you can also check out my Patreon page if you want to support me. I do hope to see you next time. Bye.